Welcome. This is the second lecture in a series from our Richman Center on Business Law and Public Policy. Just a little bit about the program, and then of course you're here, of course, to hear Peter. The Richman Center was set up with two purposes in mind. One is to bring about more collaboration between scholars in business and economics on the one hand, and scholars in the law. Many of our nation's biggest problems involve both types at the table, and we think we can facilitate that. The second is to have a mandate for evidence-based discussions. Now, for those of you who fly to Washington frequently, you'll know that that's somewhat different than some of the discussions we have. But the goal of the center is to really provide that, and I think does a wonderful job. Tonight, we're really honored to have Peter Orszag with us. He doesn't need an introduction, but I'll give him one anyway. He's currently vice chair at Citigroup, which is, of course, run by a Columbia Business School graduate, I will remind you, where he is responsible for corporate and investment banking. As if that weren't enough, he is also at the NYU Law School and the Council on Foreign Relations. He, of course, in the Obama administration, was the director of the Office of Management and Budget. Prior to that, was the director of the Congressional Budget Office. Has many, many accomplishments in his scholarly work as well as his government work. Tonight, I know he wants to share with us a perspective on U.S. macro conditions and political polarization. I asked him when we were talking before, now what country is that? We don't live in a polarized society, what you're talking about, but he is going to educate us on that. Before we turn the program over to Peter, though, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Jesse Green, to set the stage. And again, welcome to do that.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I'd just like to make a couple of opening comments. We first started this particular program, planned this program. We wanted to do this before the election, and we were fortunate not only to have it before the election, but one day before the presidential debate. So I think it's doubly timely. And we were also thinking about the fiscal cliff coming up, which is supposed to impact us by as much as $560 billion in federal expenditures and 4% on 2013 GDP, if that were to happen. Truly breathtaking numbers. All of this is something that we all need to understand better, and we're just truly pleased to have Peter Orszag here to help us understand this better. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Peter. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. It's been a pleasure to exchange views and kind of often debate Glenn and others over the years, and I'm very happy to be at Columbia. I want to talk about basically three things. One is a longer-term perspective on what's affecting the U.S. economy. The second is the aftermath of the financial crisis, including its impact on our fiscal course, and some discussion of our long-term fiscal path as part of that. And then finally end on political polarization, because it is impossible to understand what happened last summer and to evaluate what is likely to happen towards the end of this year without delving into a little bit of political science on what's happening to polarization in the country. So with that, let's start with the decades-long perspective. One of the stylized facts of growth that you undoubtedly learned in intermediate macroeconomics from Nicholas Kaldor is that the share of national income that accrues to labor and to capital is supposed to remain constant over long periods of time. I don't think it takes a Columbia MBA to look at those graphs and say that that's not constant. Across pretty much every developed economy, there's been a noticeable decline in labor share of national income over the past 2 to 3 decades. If you calibrate this for the United States, the decline in national income since the decline in the share of national income since 1980 accruing to labor compensation accounts for about $750 billion at today's national income levels. That is to say, if this had not happened, at today's national income levels, there'd be $750 billion a year more in labor compensation, which is, by any metric, a lot of money. Why is that happening? The leading explanation is that the effective global labor supply has doubled to quadrupled over that period of time. The effective global capital supply has not, and we are in the midst of an adjustment process to that series of changes. One consequence of this phenomena is that the share of global GDP measured at purchasing power parity, but even at market exchange rates, that is accounted for by the United States is declining. And similarly, conversely, the share that is coming from developing Asia is rising rapidly. And I think the big question is how long and how dramatically this will continue. And the only thing I'd say about that is that this chart suggests there's plenty of additional room for the process to continue over a fairly long period of time, because China in particular, is so far away from the technological frontier in terms of per capita GDP that there's plenty of catch-up room before they start to encounter many of the more difficult growth challenges once you're at the technological frontier, and the nature of growth shifts dramatically as you approach it. The only thing I'd say about that is there does appear to be a growing debate about whether the so-called Lewis transition point, that is when shifting people from agriculture to manufacture and services no longer adds to aggregate productivity, whether China is actually much closer to that than this graph would suggest. And to the extent that that's true, we could talk more about that if people are interested, this is a misleading indicator of how much more catch-up there is to do. The consequence for the US economy, though, is not just the declining share of national income that's accruing to labor compensation, but also it has important distributional consequences. In the middle of the income distribution, in the middle of an earnings distribution, we've had flat to declining wages for a long period of time. The red line is for all full-time male workers, the blue line is if you include the part-time and zeros, and that's not a pretty picture for anyone up to maybe even the 60th or 70th percentile in the earnings distribution. The future, by the way, I should also just mention quickly, the Bloomberg column that I wrote that will be out in a half an hour talks about another consequence that has been accruing over the past, or occurring over the past 2 to 3 decades, which got some attention last week when there was a new health affairs article on it, but it is frankly, there's been a variety of other research findings suggesting the same thing, which is that the stagnation in income for the bottom part of the income distribution is being matched by a stagnation and perhaps even a decline in life expectancy at the bottom of the education distribution. And the result of that, and the consequence of that, is that not only is there a growing income inequality gap, which I think is now well appreciated, but there's a growing life expectancy gap. If you look at, again, by education, the gap has increased by 5 or 6 years in life expectancy since 1980. That is a huge increase between the least educated and most educated. One consequence of that, just as an aside, by the way, even though I'm now going off topic, but that's okay. One consequence of that is that I'm back in an academic setting, all sorts of bad things like that. One consequence of that is that Social Security and Medicare, on a lifetime basis, become less progressive. Because if you just think about it, take Social Security, when you're receiving $1 per year for each year that you're alive, if the high income, high educated person is increasingly alive for a longer number of years, the system is becoming less progressive. Peter Diamond and I, about 5 years ago, noted this phenomena, and suggested that motivated, or that provided a justification for making the annual benefit within Social Security more progressive, with the goal of keeping lifetime progressivity roughly constant over time. You could apply the same logic to Medicare, although the specific tools that one would use to accomplish the same objective are a little bit more complicated. The point being, again, it's not just earnings and income that are experiencing a divergence, it's also things like life expectancy. Another little-known dimension of change over time, though, which is actually, I think, quite interesting, is that historically we always assumed that economic growth benefited those at the bottom of the income distribution the most. That is, the beta, that is, their own household income with regard to real GDP growth, was highest for low-income people. This is the rising tide lifting the bottom end most dramatically. That is still true, But there's an interesting development over the past couple of decades, which is the beta of very high-income people has increased very substantially. And so what this chart shows you is the responsiveness, that beta, for the top 1%, the top 0.1%, the top 0.01%, and you just see it rising dramatically over time at the same time that we've been experiencing that globalization and technological change. And the result of that now is that if you look across the income distribution and look at the response to an expansion, the response is the strongest at the bottom, but then also at the top. You used to not have that tick up in the blue line. And conversely, during a downturn, during a recession, the top experiences a much more dramatic decline in their income. You shouldn't cry for them, but nonetheless, their volatility is much higher. And so in understanding things like why high-end retail declined dramatically in response to this recession and then came back more strongly, it's not surprising because that's probably what was happening to high-end income at the same time. So what do we do about this? The two basic answers typically are education and tax policy, with a little bit of infrastructure and other things thrown in there. If high-educated people are better able to combat the globalization and technological change in the tradable sector, and they're living longer and all sorts of benefits, one obvious answer is get more education. Unfortunately, we've had, up until the cohort that was born around 1950, a big wind at our backs in terms of rising average educational attainment. And then as you can see, that rate of increase basically stopped, and we've gone sideways in terms of average educational attainment in the United States for a couple decades now. The obvious intervention here is that if you look at where college enrollment and college completion rates are the lowest, they're the lowest at the low end of the income distribution. So this chart just shows you by birth cohort college completion rates, and you can see that the college completion rate at the top has gone up much more than at the bottom. There's plenty of room to level that curve and thereby help both distributionally in terms of total productivity growth. One response to this is often, well, the high ability kids who are from low income families are completing college at a perfectly fine rate, so don't worry about it. And I think the evidence is not suggestive that that's right. If you look, for example, this chart shows you, this is actually, if you want an indictment of the state of American society, look at this graph. This graph ranks students by 8th grade test scores, so one metric of ability. Low-income kids who are at the top of their test score distribution in 8th grade complete college at basically the same rate as the lowest scoring kids from the highest income classification. That should not happen. And that is strongly suggestive that there are plenty of other barriers that could be eliminated, even for high ability kids from low income families, that would help distributionally and that would help in terms of total productivity. What about taxes? The first thing to say about taxes is the bulk of what has happened with regard to income inequality in the United States is a pre-tax phenomenon. So this chart shows you the Gini index, which is one metric of inequality, on market income, and then which is pre-tax income, and then after tax, after transfer income, and you can see that basically the trends have followed each other. So most of the reason that we've seen a very dramatic increase in income inequality has nothing to do with the tax system, and we'll come back to this at the end. But the other thing I'd say is if you look at effective tax rates, if anything, they have declined at the very top of the income distribution, which is to say it may not be primarily a tax story, but in my mind, there's no reason why the tax system should be exacerbating it rather than leaning against the wind. And so I think there is an argument in the face of this dramatic explosion in pre-tax incomes for a more progressive tax system, along with a more progressive Social Security system in response to divergent trends in life expectancy. So that's the kind of longer term underlying tectonic plate perspective on what's happening to the US economy. What about a higher frequency, what's been happening over the past couple of year perspective? And here I think the story is mostly, it's not good to go through a financial crisis. and how far along are we in the aftermath of that crisis. And what I would say is we are most but not all the way through that deleveraging process. So let me just give you a couple perspectives on that. First, under any definition of the term, going from about 30% of GDP in private sector borrowing to minus 15% of GDP in private sector borrowing, which is basically what happened to the US between 2007 and 2009, 45% of GDP implosion in non-federal borrowing would count as trauma under any reasonable definition of that term. And the two predictable consequences from phenomena like this, where you have a very severe financial constraint in the financial sector, an implosion basically, is a very weak labor market for an extended period of time and a very rapid run-up in sovereign debt for a significant period of time also. If you look across other countries that have experienced things like this in the past, the unemployment rate increased by dramatic amounts, 7 percentage points, with the peak unemployment rate not being hit for 5 years. So just to put that in context, if the crisis hit in the US in 2007 and our unemployment rate was 5%, these averages would suggest the unemployment rate would have kept rising, according to this historical average, until this year, and would hit a rate of 12%. That just underscores how dramatic the aftermath of these kinds of episodes tend to be. The second consequence is governments they experience a reduction in revenue and some increase in means-tested benefit spending when the economy is subjected to that kind of shock. They also typically step in to provide subsidies to the financial sector. And they also typically step in to provide some kind of macroeconomic stimulus to cushion the blow in terms of the labor market. The result of all those, the combination of those things is a very significant increase in debt as a share of GDP. And you see just these dramatic sovereign debt increases in the aftermath of these kinds of experiences. So where are we relative to that historical average? The first thing to say is the labor market is not in good shape. The unemployment rate has come down, but if you look at the employment to population ratio, which is a better way of measuring the state of the labor market, it was about 62 to 63% before the crisis. It fell to 58 to 59% during the crisis, and it's stayed there since then. This chart does not suggest any pulse in the labor market over the past 3 or 4 years. That difference of about 4% of the population, if you just stop and think about it for a moment, is a huge problem, because we face the risk of what happened to continental Europe during the early 1980s, of people permanently losing their attachment to the workforce because their morale deteriorates, their work skills lessen, and so on and so forth. A couple metrics of that. If you look at just the number of people who have been unemployed for 27 weeks or more, we're talking about more than 5 million people. And again, just think about what it would be like to be unemployed for 27 weeks or even a full year. And the numbers are suggestive of something like 4 million or so there. Being unemployed for a full year is not good for your reemployment prospects. Another metric of the risk here is if you look at what's been happening to the disability insurance program in the United States, awards and applications, both of them are up north of 30% over the past 4 years. There's no way the underlying incidence rate of disability has gone up that much over that period of time. That is a response to a weak labor market. Someone cannot find a job, runs out of unemployment insurance benefits, and out of necessity or urgency applies for disability insurance benefits, gets on them. The problem is the exit rate from disability insurance is basically 0. So a 50-year-old goes on the disability insurance program, that person's not working again for 15 years. This is another reason why, by the way, I think we have to at least take into account another potential impact of failing to extend unemployment insurance benefits, because the typical argument is it causes people not to look for work if they have, or not to find work, not to get reemployed, if they are receiving unemployment benefits. But if the alternative is that, at least under unemployment insurance, you have to be sure that you're looking for work. If the alternative is you cut them off from unemployment benefit and they go on disability benefit, even from a work incentive perspective, that's much worse, because those people are never working again, period, even if the economy recovers. What about the broader deleveraging point? And this will lead us into the public sector debt component. Actually, you know what, I'm going to skip these and turn to fiscal policy. What I will say on fiscal policy, in response to this duality of problems, a weak labor market and a rapid increase in debt, the right policy response is a duality of upfront stimulus, tax cuts, infrastructure spending, coupled with deficit reduction that's enacted now but takes effect over time. That is the right policy combination in the United States, Europe, and Japan, and no one's doing it. One of the counter arguments against that is, well, we can't actually, some people are doing immediate fiscal austerity, some people are doing stimulus, no one's doing the combo in the right way. One of the counter arguments is, well, we can't do the delayed fiscal austerity because Congress will always undo it, or it's not credible, or what have you. I think that's inconsistent with the historical evidence. We can do delayed fiscal consolidation in the wrong way, which, by the way, is basically what we're doing today, and I'll come back to that in a second. But if you do it in the right way, the history suggests we actually stick to it. The right way is specific gradual steps. Let me give you an example. In the 1983 Social Security reforms, we raised the normal retirement age under Social Security in 2 stages, once between 2000 and 2005. The second stage is 2017 to 2022. The first stage took effect without a hiccup, and I'd be willing to bet the second stage will also. The reason, again, is specific. The retirement age will rise by this schedule and gradual, 2 months a year. So it's not a cliff. Instead, we're putting all our money down on what I'll call cap and punt, which is we'll put a cap on some spending category, provide no underlying detail behind it, and also have it be a steep decline. That is virtually guaranteed not to work in terms of delaying fiscal consolidation. But the fact that that doesn't work doesn't mean that there isn't an approach that would work. And again, specific and gradual is the way to go. I'd also say, by the way, I think this informs why the debate over the 2009 stimulus is off. The debate over the 2009 stimulus at this point is either it didn't work on the one hand, or it was too small on the other. And I think both of them are wrong. The reason they're both wrong is if you look at the cross-state evidence, not only the macroeconometric evidence, but the cross-state evidence on economic performance relative to where the stimulus dollars went. And if you just sort of, the configuration of assumptions you have to come up with to get a multiplier of 0 as opposed to some positive number is so extreme that the argument that it did nothing strikes me as completely implausible. On the other hand, the folks say, who reject that hypothesis, they say, well, the problem was it wasn't 1.2 trillion or 1.5 trillion or what have you. I'm not even going to get into the congressional dynamics about that. I want to actually just address the substance of what if we could have had a much bigger stimulus, abstracting from the political constraints. The problem with that perspective is the frame that was adopted was temporary, timely, and targeted. If you had delivered more stimulus in the fourth quarter of 2009, I don't think 2011 would have wound up being that different. The problem was not the amount of stimulus that was being delivered in late 2009. The problem was the amount of stimulus being delivered in mid-2011 or early this year. And that's a much different problem. The problem was not the size of the stimulus, but its duration. And all the people who were in favor of a bigger stimulus were not really in favor of delivering it over a longer period of time. They just wanted more over that same time period, and I'm not sure that would have fundamentally changed very much. What about the future? My view on the fiscal situation in which we find ourselves, so that other part of that duality, is that the deficit in 2020 is a different beast than the deficit in 2050. And this is not a politically popular thing to say, what I'm about to say, but I'll say it anyway. I don't think that you can get to a reasonable deficit to GDP ratio in 2020 if you care about the cash flow deficit in that year without the bulk of the adjustment coming on the revenue side. Let me just try to explain that for a second. The projected deficit for 2020 under current policy is something like 6% of GDP. I should immediately say, people talk with this false precision. Most of the budget discussion in Washington is 1.274 trillion. Okay, so the deficit projection for 2020 is about 6% of GDP. The 90% confidence interval around that projection is plus or minus 5% of GDP. So I should have said 1 to 11 with a central estimate of 6. And therefore, anything that's down to the tens of billions of dollars, you should just completely, let's take 6 as the central estimate. Debt stability as a share of GDP requires something more in the range of 3. So how do you get from 6 to 3? First place to obviously look is on the spending side. 2 problems arise immediately. First, most entitlement changes will be phased in over time. So by 2020, you don't get as much traction as you might think. So let's take Social Security as an example, since that's the one that, even if it's not the biggest fiscal problem, people often talk about. Almost every Social Security reform plan out there exempts those who are 55 and above from any benefit changes at all because they're close to retirement or in retirement. That means you're having no effect on benefits at all, 0.000, for 7 years until the 55-year-olds hit the early stage of 62. And even then, it's just a tiny sliver as that first cohort comes into eligibility. It builds over time. But by 2020, you have almost no effect. Similarly, proposals like, which we'll return to in a moment, block granting Medicaid and what have you, most of the impact is past the 2020 horizon. So then you're left with discretionary spending, which has already been kind of clamped down on. I don't think you can get more than, say, 1% of GDP realistically in further spending reductions by relative to this current policy baseline by 2020, which means you need 2% of GDP on the revenue side. Neither party's willing to admit to that, so that's actually why we wind up with this cap and punt approach, because if you're locking in a revenue base that's inadequate, but you still want to hit these out-year deficit targets, you just lean harder and harder on discretionary spending caps without providing any detail, because that's the only way you can make the numbers add up. But that's an aside. That's the 2020 deficit. 2050 deficit is much different, because here it's clear the bulk of the adjustment's going to have to come on the spending side, and within that, the story is basically healthcare. Between now and 2050, Medicare, Medicaid, and other health expenditures go from 5.5% of GDP to 12. Social Security goes from 5% of GDP to 6. So the long-term deficit problem really fundamentally is a healthcare cost growth one, much different than the next 5 or 10 year deficit issue. And that requires us to delve a little bit into healthcare. I remain optimistic that we can have a much more efficient healthcare system in the US. And the reason I remain optimistic is not primarily the cross-country comparisons, which suggest very significant differences in costs relative to other countries. I'm always a little skeptical because those are difficult to do right given all the differences between the United States and other countries. But if you look across different parts of the United States, or even across different hospitals within the same city, you see dramatic variation in how healthcare is being practiced. This chart shows you, I didn't mean to put the high cost, bad performing counties in blue. It could have been in red, either way you want to do it, but there's a huge amount of variation across the United States in cost per beneficiary that cannot be explained by anything that the folks up at Dartmouth have tried to explain it with. People are still coming up with novel explanations. Someone came up to me at a talk a couple months ago and said it has to do with cloud cover. But anyway, there's a huge amount of variation. The variation is not correlated with quality in any noticeable way. If anything, the correlation goes the wrong way between cost and quality. And that opens up a huge possibility in terms of delivering healthcare more efficiently. One thing that's immediately said is, well, those dark areas of the country have our leading academic medical centers, but our leading academic medical centers themselves vary substantially in terms of how they practice healthcare. This just shows you the days in hospital for patients in the last 6 months of life. And even within New York City, NYU Medical versus NYU Presbyterian or Mount Sinai, where I'm on the board, you see these vast differences in the number of days in hospital, and associated with that is the costs associated with the episodes. Dramatic variation. Uwe Reinhardt at Princeton likes to look at this kind of chart and say, I don't really understand, how can the best medical care in the world cost twice as much as the best medical care in the world? And there's actually a lot to that. If you look even across, I'll just show you some charts in a moment, even across physicians within a hospital, amazing amounts of variation. Now here's where it gets interesting. Because that variation isn't correlated with quality, if there's some way of reducing it towards the median, say, the evidence suggests that we may not suffer any quality deterioration, and actually perhaps even an improvement. Evidence based on this kind of variation in terms of that potential amounts to about $750 billion a year in healthcare services that are delivered that don't improve health outcomes. Now what's interesting, and that's basically consistent with the cross-country comparisons if you want to go that way too. Now just tie that back to the labor compensation point I made earlier. If we were able to capture even a significant share of that, it's perhaps the best hope that we have for offsetting part of the decline in labor share of national income that's occurred, because frankly most of the other stuff isn't likely to work. So not only in terms of our fiscal trajectory at the federal level, at the state level, but also in terms of take-home pay, we should be very focused on this problem. All right, so first let me give you a little bit of good news, and then we'll turn to the future. A little bit of good news is there has been a dramatic deceleration in healthcare spending over the past few years. The big debate is whether this is all cyclical or whether part of it's structural. Perspectives on this obviously are getting a little distorted. There was a report out last week suggesting that in the commercial space, in 2010, growth rate was 3.8%. In 2011, it was 4.5%, and that was a stunning rapid increase that completely changes the picture, when historically these things have been growing at 8, 9, 10%. Regardless of whether it's 4.5% or 3.8% or whatever, there's been a very substantial slowdown over the past couple of years. And the question becomes, is it all just because the economy is weak, or is there a structural component to it? Very important question, because if it's all cyclical, it's going to disappear as the economy comes back. Let me tell you why I think, at least obviously the economy has a lot to do with it, but why I think part of it is structural. The first is just look at this chart. The deceleration, if anything, has been more dramatic in Medicare than in the rest of the healthcare system. And if it were all just the economy, that would be really good. Because Medicare beneficiaries typically have Medigap insurance or other kind of supplementary insurance. So their co-payments are typically a smaller fraction of their services delivered than in the commercial space. And secondly, their income is better protected against financial and macroeconomic fluctuations because most of it's Social Security. So if this were all a macroeconomic phenomenon, you'd expect these curves to be flipped, with Medicare not really slowing down that much and the commercial index slowing down a lot more. Second thing is, if you look across states, what you can do, look at where the deceleration in Medicare is coming from. If it were all the economy, you'd expect the deceleration to be more dramatic, where the unemployment rate has gone up more, or where housing prices have gone down more, neither of which is true. Okay, so I think there's something else going on here. What else could it be? I think there's three big structural changes that are already happening in healthcare, and that frankly will continue to happen regardless of whether Mr. Romney or Mr. Obama is elected in Washington. First is the dividing line between the payer and the provider, that is the insurance company and the hospital, is getting blurry. The reason this is happening is private insurance companies and Medicare are moving away from fee-for-service payment and towards other forms of payment, whether it's bundling or accountable care organizations. We'll talk about these things in a moment. But basically, if you're a hospital system and you're at risk for how much health care Glenn uses when he is enrolled in the hospital, the dividing line between you and an insurance company kind of gets a little blurry. And that's exactly what's happening. You're seeing a lot of merger activity. Insurance companies are acquiring providers. Providers are acquiring the analytical tools that insurance companies have typically deployed to manage that kind of risk. And that's good, because that change in the payment system, that line getting blurred, moves us away from fee-for-service payment, and it's helpful. The second is the IT backbone in hospitals and physician offices is dramatically expanding. And what that opens up is two possibilities. The first is much increased use of clinical decision support software, which helps to narrow this variation. I'm going to show you an example of that in a second. And the second is benchmarking of physicians, where you can finally sit down and say, I don't understand why you're using so much more than this other guy. Final thing, which got a little bit of press attention, but it's been happening over a longer period of time, is employers, especially in their retiree healthcare, but also in their current employee healthcare, are moving towards a defined contribution model. The third one obviously doesn't apply to Medicare, but the first two do. All three of these are going to continue over the next decade. And I actually think I'm more optimistic about what the healthcare market in 2020 is going to look like relative to today than most people are. Let me give you an example, though, of that second phenomenon. If I didn't erase it. So these are data, because I find this kind of thing interesting. These are data from Mass General that was experiencing a very dramatic increase in outpatient imaging, so CAT scans, MRIs, what have you, on an outpatient basis. And you can see a trend before a certain thing happened, and then a break in that trend. And what happened there? What happened there was they did two things. They put in a clinical decision support software, a physician order entry system, where if you wanted to order one of these things, you had to enter it into a computer, and if it wasn't indicated by their clinical guidelines, you had to explain why. You could still do it, but you had to type in why. Okay? Second thing that they did was they actually sat the physician down and said, I'm going to show you this graph in a second, Glenn, you're ordering 3 times as many tests as your colleagues are. We don't understand why. Okay? So let's look at what happened. You see the break in trend, but here's the distribution, and this is what I find interesting. 2 things about this. This is actual, on a risk-adjusted basis, images per 100 patients for individual docs at Mass General, at Partners Health. 2 things to note. First, huge variation, even on a risk-adjusted basis. So some doctors are ordering, 30 tests per 100 patients, 30 images, and some are down at like 5. Massive variation. Again, risk-adjusted. The second is, I'm not showing you this, but it's true, there's a lot of persistence. The high-order doctors tend to be high-order doctors, high-intensity doctors year after year after year. Okay, so they put this in, they say, we don't understand why your practice has drifted to be so intense relative to your colleagues. And the thing I want you to know is not only did the mean come down, but the standard error did too. You're getting compression, so obviously there's still a lot of variation, but you're getting compression in the variation. And they didn't do anything other than put in a clinical decision support software and benchmarking. Okay, so there's promise there, and we'll come back to that. What about the future? And this is obviously at the heart of the presidential debate. There are basically 2 different approaches that are being put forward, and by the way, they don't need to be mutually inconsistent. You could do some of both of them, and frankly, I think we should. The question is relative emphasis. One is the consumer-driven approach, in which the basic argument is the problem is consumers don't have enough skin in the game, and if they had more skin in the game, the problem is third-party insurance, and if we had more skin in the game, the world would be a different place. And the other perspective is we really need to focus on the providers and what suggestions they're making to their patients in the high-cost cases. So evidence in favor of the first perspective is, if you look at the RAND experiment on to how people have responded to prescription drug plans, cost sharing matters. And if people have more cost sharing, they do cut back on utilization rates. And most of the evidence suggests that that doesn't actually harm outcomes. So that's all good. The problem with this approach, to my mind, is the concentration of healthcare costs is so extreme that you don't get quite as much traction as you might think. And so if under a consumer-driven approach, you're still going to provide deep third-party insurance against very high costs, which after all is the whole point of insurance and is embodied in things like a health savings account, you don't get as much traction as you might otherwise believe because most of the costs are in those catastrophic cases. So if you rank Medicare beneficiaries by their cost, for example, top 5% of Medicare beneficiaries account for more than 40% of the total Medicare spend. The top 25% of Medicare beneficiaries account for 85% of the total. So a consumer-driven approach with more cost sharing has its biggest impact on the other 75% of beneficiaries, but they're only 15% of the total spend. So even if you have a dramatic impact on them, you're not doing that much for the public. Now there is some evidence from the RAND experiment that applying more cost sharing before you reach the deep third-party insurance reduces the cost even above that threshold. But again, even incorporating that, you're not getting as much action as you might otherwise think. I'm going to skip over that and just add one other comment on the basic approach that's been put forward by Mr. Romney, which would have private insurance plans in the revised version coexist with traditional Medicare. 2 points that I'd like to make about that. One, first, we already have it because Medicare Advantage plans account for about 30% of Medicare beneficiaries. So what we're really talking about is a change in the way the plans are compensated for covering individuals, because if not, it's not really any different. You could call it something else, but it's not really any different. the Medicare Advantage. The evidence from those Medicare Advantage bids are interesting for two reasons. First, there is evidence suggesting that the bids come in below traditional fee-for-service cost. There's also evidence, so I'm going to back to that in a second. There's also evidence, however, that the bids respond to the legislative payment rates that change over time. The second fact, it has some sort of fundamental questions about how competitive the markets are. But let me just focus on this first fact because it's gotten some attention. So Medicare Advantage plans bid about 9% below, if you judge them by their second lowest bid, which is how the Romney-Ryan plan would work, 9% below traditional fee-for-service Medicare. That's what has been put forward as suggesting that there might be significant cost savings here. But what I want to emphasize is the 9% below is probably still a cost increaser for the Medicare program, because private plans can risk select so well that they are probably still overpaid for the beneficiaries who are enrolled in those plans. There is a paper that I cite, and I can give you the citation in one of my recent Bloomberg columns that looks at this specifically. And the point being, if given whatever risk-adjusted payment Medicare is making, you can select the disproportionately healthy beneficiaries, then even at 91 cents on the dollar, you may be being overpaid for those particular beneficiaries. And again, the best evidence that we have suggests that's exactly what's happening. So unless you have a much better risk adjustment, let me give you one other indication of this. The risk adjustment that Medicare uses can explain about 10% of the subsequent year's variation in costs. So it basically does, and that's, by the way, a big improvement over what was used a decade or so ago. So if anyone thinks that private insurance companies that are very focused on this can't, in the other 90% of the variation, find some way of making money, then the 9% estimate is right. But if you don't believe that, then it has some questions. The alternative way forward is to say, look, those high-cost cases are where the money is. We've really got to focus, therefore, on what providers are recommending in those cases, because you're always going to have pretty deep third-party insurance against costs. And you better be focused on what the provider's recommending in those cases, because that will help, that has a big effect on the care that's delivered. I personally think that that's where the emphasis should be. And I already mentioned some of the things that are happening in terms of moving away from fee-for-service payment and moving towards clinical decision support software that can help. But I'll just leave that out there as I think directionally where more of the emphasis should be. And let me just turn now to my final topic, which has to do with how we're going to end this year and what will happen thereafter. In order to understand what happened last summer and what may well happen later this year, I think we first need to take a brief detour into political science. So let's do that. This chart shows you voting patterns in the House of Representatives. The blue curve is Democrats, the red curve is Republicans. The thing I want you to notice is that in the late 1960s, there was a significant amount of overlap between the most conservative Democrats and the most liberal Republicans. The intersection of those two curves was where most of the big legislative deals got done. Roll forward to the mid to late 1980s, and that overlap is dwindling. Roll forward to today, and it's gone. So we now have a bimodal Congress, congratulations, with no middle, and it is very difficult to get legislation done in the wake of that. So it's very important then to understand why is this happening, because that will speak to whether it's an ephemeral phenomenon or whether we're going to be living with this for a while. So if you ask the typical CNN talking head, why is this happening, the immediate response is gerrymandering. So let's just start with that. That is, we are drawing congressional districts into things that look like pieces of spaghetti, creating safe Democratic districts and safe Republican districts, and that causes this polarization. The first thing to note about that is this chart shows you polarization in the House and the Senate. And what it shows you is that the Senate has polarized almost as much as the House, not quite, but almost. And to my knowledge, we have not redrawn state lines. So it raises an immediate question, even for a non-political scientist, about the gerrymandering explanation. A more sophisticated political science analysis, and there is a literature on this, suggests maybe 10 or 15% of the increase can be explained by gerrymandering. So then the key question becomes, okay, if it's not gerrymandering, Is it still just the kind of, it's the bums in Washington polarizing relative to a centrist population, or is a significant part of this the population itself polarizing and then being reflected in the Congress? That matters a lot, because if it's just, look, the easiest thing would have been if it were gerrymandering. That would have been great because we know what to do. It's hard to do, but you go and try to change the districting laws, redistricting laws. If it was just the people in Washington, there's some hope that if you voted in a new set of people, that might have some effect. If it's ourselves, we've got a bigger problem. I think we have a bigger problem. So let me give you the best evidence in favor of it's just the people in Washington are observations like more than a dozen states have senators from different parties. They're clearly representing the same constituents in dramatically different ways, suggesting some operational flexibility to divert from a centrist population. There is a school of thought out at Stanford consistent with this, that the population is centrist and it's just inside the Beltway phenomenon. I am increasingly skeptical that that's correct. Let me give you a couple perspectives. First, if you look at polling data on whether your representative has grown too extreme for you, you would have expected that to start skyrocketing if it were just an inside the Beltway phenomenon. That hasn't happened. More importantly, you can look at state legislatures. State legislatures are closer to the population than the federal legislature is. So if it were an inside the Beltway phenomenon, you'd expect state legislatures to be polarizing less than the House of Representatives. Here's state legislatures over the past 2 decades or so. Vertical line is the House of Representatives. You're to the left of that. I didn't mean to imply anything about left-right, but you're to the left of that, you've polarized less than the House of Representatives. To the right, you've polarized more. There's obviously a huge amount of variation. 2/3 of the state's legislatures have polarized more. So I am increasingly of the view, for this and some other reasons, that a big part of this is while the Congress is more polarized than the population, the trend is that the population has been polarizing. And that is a fundamental structural problem. Now that in turn causes us to ask how is the population itself polarizing? And what I'd say is one of the strongest findings from social psychology is if you put like-minded people together in a group, the group will become more extreme than any given individual within it. Even sophisticated people. My colleague Cass Sunstein has this great study where he looked at voting patterns for judges based on who appointed them. And it basically, you put three democratically appointed judges together on a panel. The panel's going to go left relative to their previous voting patterns. Put 3 Republican appointed judges together on a panel, same thing. This is a general phenomenon that is displayed in a whole variety of social settings. You want to prove that you're the true member of the tribe, you only hear self-reinforcing views, and so on. Both physically and virtually, I think we are increasingly surrounding ourselves with like-minded people. Let me show you physically first. We are literally separating ourselves into Republican and Democratic neighborhoods in the United States. This is county-level data, so there are about 3,000 counties or so in the US. A measure of whether it's polarized is whether it landslides hard one way or another in a presidential election. This comes from a great book called The Big Sort, which is much less popular than The Big Short, but it's very good. The black counties are landslide Democrats. The gray ones are landslide Republican. Look at the white means that it's a politically heterogeneous county, politically mixed county. This is a very mixed political country. You could have done this for the elections in the 60s or 70s, doesn't matter. So look at all that white, that's then, this is now. More than 30% of the US population today, relative to the 1970s, lives in a landslide county. And that, by the way, you can't explain that based on gerrymandering because we haven't changed the county lines. We are sorting ourselves into self-selecting into Republican and Democratic neighborhoods. Part of this, by the way, is related to income segregation. Mixed income neighborhoods are disappearing. And one of the reasons why that's then correlated with this phenomenon, people get this wrong. They think there's not an income gradient to party affiliation because they look at the New York and California and they say, look, those are blue states, they're Democratic, and they're high income. What that misses is that the variation in average income across the states is very small relative to the variation in income within a state. And if you look at the income gradient within a state, as you move up the income distribution, you are more likely to vote Republican. The difference, by the way, is in heavily Republican states like Texas, basically the gradient is very steep. So there are effectively no, and I know this because my in-laws live in Houston, there are effectively no high, maybe around Austin there are a few, but there are effectively no high-income Democrats living in Texas anymore. In New York, as you go up the income distribution, it's still the case that it's more likely you're a Republican than a Democrat, but the gradient isn't quite as steep. And that less steep gradient, even though it's still upward sloping, is enough to flip the state as a whole to be Democratic. So this is related in part to income segregation by neighborhood. What about virtually? Well, it used to be that we all got our news from a newspaper, which was heavily edited, and therefore took out the fringes, and evening news, which was heavily produced, and therefore, again, took out the fringe views. Heavily centralizing force. Now with technological change, we can all self-select our own news feeds. My personal vignette, which is a trivial example of this, is I have a Twitter account that I don't use. I don't actually tweet anything. I just use it as a news feed, so I'm a free rider on Twitter. I still am actually amused because some people sign up to follow me, which I don't really understand. But whatever. Maybe 9 months ago or so, one of the people that I had self-selected to follow started to really annoy me because I'd wake up every morning and he was criticizing me. So in response to that, I unfollowed him, and I realized that 2 or 3 weeks later, he may well have still been, bombarding me with those grenades, but it didn't affect my mental space at all. And that's a trivial example, but again, replicate that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times, and you get this separating phenomena where we're the same world event viewed from Houston, Texas, where the dominant medium through which it's viewed is Fox News, is a much different world event than that same world event viewed in the West Village of New York City. It's just dramatically different because of these feedback loops and the echo chamber. So the problem then is this raises a fundamental challenge, I think, to our structure of governance, because we are kind of very happy historically to live with divided government, because the evidence actually suggests it's not quite as productive as unified government, but it was good enough that it kind of worked. And I think now you have to raise some serious questions about whether that still holds. That conclusion really depended on that middle there working. Today, that's not there. So we have, one option is political domination, in which you dominate a sort of parliamentary system in which one party dominates the House, the Senate, and the White House, and then can legislate based on only one part of that bimodal distribution. And that could work. The problem is it's A, infrequent in terms of that trifecta occurring, and B, inherently unstable. Because if you capitalize on that and you legislate on a partisan basis, you virtually guarantee sufficient backlash to wind back up in the muck of split government. And therein lies, I think, where we're going to spend a lot of our time over the next decade. And even mundane governing is much more challenging when you have this. And the reason is you're not electorally punished for conforming to your own underlying population. And that, by the way, is what is likely to happen in this election. Intrade has, Glenn, you can cover your ears, but Intrade has like an 80% probability now or so of the president getting reelected. Maybe that will change in the debate tomorrow, I don't know. But if you take that projection, and it also has the most likely scenario being the House remaining Republican, which seems virtually certain, then combine that with the observations that were made last summer that the debt limit debacle was so bad that everyone would just get punished. And who actually is getting punished? Everyone's getting reelected. And there's no reason that unless there's some dramatic defeat one way or another, that they don't just basically stick to their guns. And herein lies, let's now turn to where we're going to end the year, which is the fiscal cliff. As is well known, there is a whole variety of expiring tax provisions, spending cuts that are scheduled for the beginning of January, and we also have the debt limit hanging out there by the first quarter or so of next year. So we're right back in the muck. And the question becomes, how likely is it that we will have a deal before December 31st? And if not, how likely is it that we'll have a deal by, say, mid-January? The second question, I think, is a lot easier to answer. The people who have said we are going to have, if we don't have a deal, it's a 3 to 5% of GDP fiscal contraction, and that's really bad. One thing I can tell you is the probability of a 3 to 5% of GDP fiscal contraction is 0. Because we're either going to have a deal, in which case it's much less than that, or if we don't have a deal, we're also not raising the debt limit, in which case the fiscal contraction is way bigger than 3 to 5%. In the scenario in which, and that scenario is so bad that you're virtually certain to have a deal. The only question is how much trauma you have to go through to get there. So the probability of a deal by mid to late January, I think, is virtually certain. The harder question is it before December 31st or after? I'll just close with some thoughts on that. The obvious difficulty under the most likely scenario, president gets reelected. Actually, let me deal with the easier scenario first. If Mr. Romney wins, and in that scenario, the conditional probability of the Senate flipping is also more than 0.5. So the Republicans may well have the trifecta of the House, the Senate, and the White House. I don't think it really matters, actually, whether the fiscal cliff is dealt with before December 31st or when the new Congress comes in. There will be, a friend of mine called this bungee jumping. If we go over the cliff on December 31st, everyone will know exactly where we're going to wind up by mid to late January, because a new Congress will come in, make the tax cuts retroactive to the beginning of the year. And by the way, the interesting question then becomes, and put in place a placeholder for 6 to 9 months, extending the debt limit, which will give folks time to confirm Glenn Hubbard, and then also put in place a budget resolution that will that has an important benefit. It can carry reconciliation instructions with it, which allow you to do things with 51 votes. And so what that sets up is it takes time for that to happen. So a big fiscal deal happening, say, late summer, early fall, not in January. January is a placeholder. And then the big question, actually the interesting question under that scenario becomes what specific policies are in that big fiscal package? Because right now the Romney campaign is promising tax reform, Medicare reform, Medicaid reform, GSE reform. I mean, you can't do it. The bandwidth of the system can't handle that. So the question is what rises to the top of the heap? And I'll just say, if I had to pick one right now, it would be block granting Medicaid in that scenario, rises to the top of the heap, and I can explain why if anyone's interested. But anyway, big fiscal deal in September. The harder thing to evaluate is under the Obama victory, what happens? So the basic difficulty, of course, is right now it looks like the two positions are completely irreconcilable, and if there's no electoral damage from sticking to the guns, both sides will do that for some period of time. The administration says the tax cuts over $250,000 must end, and over my dead body will they not. The House Republicans say all tax cuts must be universal, and over my dead body are they not. Those are not easy positions to negotiate on. So what are the possible options here? And I'll just sketch them very quickly and then leave plenty of time for your questions. What could cause a deal to happen before December 31st? I point to 3 possibilities. The first is if the economy weakens very substantially, the administration is going to be more in favor of even a placeholder deal, like has started to emerge in some accounts of what's happening in the Senate. Don't rock the boat too much if job growth is not plus 100,000, but it's 0 or a negative. Second factor is if U.S. military forces are engaged in armed conflict, any new armed conflict anywhere in the world, the probability of a deal before December 31st goes up dramatically. The thought that we will impose defense spending cuts in early January when our forces are newly exposed to armed conflict, whether it's in the Gulf or in Asia or what have you, strikes me as completely implausible. And then the final factor, those two are hopefully not the central scenario. So the final factor, which is an interesting one, and you're already picking up some hints of this also, is the possibility, if you look back at these cycles before, polarization goes in cycles. What tends to happen is one party gets defeated decisively enough that after moving apart, they start to move back towards the center. And it's at least possible, I think it's not likely, but it's possible that the combination of a decisive electoral college defeat for Mr. Romney and the loss of a noticeable, although not determinative, number of seats for Tea Party Republicans in the House would cause at least a little softening. I think in that kind of scenario, there's going to be some revisiting of, was it just a bad candidate that caused the problem, or is there some change in our stance that needs to happen? And there may well be a lot of talk about that. In which case, you can imagine if there's some combination of the first and third, that the administration is willing to go up from 250,000, the House Republicans are willing to come down from infinity to some other number, and you could possibly get a deal done by December 31st. I don't actually think that that's the most likely outcome, but it's possible. If that doesn't happen, what's the alternative? If it doesn't happen, the alternative is we're going to go over the fiscal cliff, and it's going to be like base jumping instead of bungee jumping, because people aren't really going to know where we're going to wind up exactly. The only thing I would say about that scarier proposition is it at least opens up the possibility for, the tax cuts have all expired at the end of December. It opens up the possibility of the administration stepping forward with a universal tax cut that's much more progressive than what just expired. So imagine, just to take an example, a significant payroll tax cut coupled with an increase in the standard deduction. Cuts taxes for basically everyone, but in a much more progressive fashion than what just expired. Combined with, and therefore it's a little harder for House Republicans to vote against, combined with, and this is where it would get hard, but combined with the administration stepping forward with a more aggressive entitlement reform, for example, Social Security reform. The left goes crazy, but the president then basically says, look, I just came forward, it's unfortunate we spent the last 2 months fighting. CNBC is nonstop, what a disaster this is. I just came forward with a universal tax cut and a admittedly progressive but nonetheless Social Security reform, and we're still going to blow up the country over this. So the difficulty that I see, by the way, is that may or may not work, and the problem is, even if we have a deal by mid to late January, the amount of trauma and discord and what have you, and volatility that is created in the meanwhile. Stepping back just for a second, before I take your questions. Longer term, I think the bigger issues are stagnation of median and, frankly, rising income distribution effects from globalization. That we continue not to do the things that would help to mitigate the risk of hysteresis, in particular the kind of barbell approach of more stimulus combined with out-year deficit reduction. I'm a little more optimistic on trajectory in healthcare than the conventional wisdom. And the final issue is we have, regardless of what happens in December or January, an underlying structural polarization problem that's going to be with us for a significant period of time. Again, thank you again for having me, and I think we have a little bit of time for questions. Thank you.